All right, I'm sure we've still got folks on their way, but I'm gonna go ahead and kick us off here. Um, Thanks so much to everybody for being here this evening. It's a real pleasure to get to host. My name's Liberty, and I'm part of the Firestorm Collective. And today we're really excited to be hosting author and multidisciplinary artist Rasheedah Phillips in conversation with Danielle Purifoy. They'll be discussing Rasheedah's new book, Dismantling the Masters Clock, on race, space, and time. It's a really incredible new title, unlike anything else that I've ever seen AK Press publish. So I know we're going to have a great conversation. For folks who haven't attended an event with our collective previously, Firestorm is a 17-year-old radical bookstore that's operated by a queer feminist collective in Southern Appalachia on the land of the Cherokee people. And we do a lot of in-person events, but are still also trying to do as many of these great virtual conversations as possible, both because it's fantastic to get to connect with folks at a distance, and also because we know that even here in our own community, there's a lot of folks for whom in-person gathering is challenging. So if you're interested in virtual events or in-person events for that matter, you can check out our calendar, and I'll also drop a link in the chat in just a moment. So tonight we are using Zoom, which has both an open chat, which I encourage you to use, and also a Q&A tool. As we go, if you've got questions for Rasheedah or Danielle, definitely put those in the chat in the Q&A tool if you don't mind. Things might get lost in the chat. The Q&A is a great place to keep track of them. And we're going to do our best to circle around and take a look at some of those questions and answer what we can at the end of the event. So we're going to kick off here with some quick bios for Rasheedah and Danielle. Rasheedah Phillips is a queer housing advocate, lawyer, parent, and interdisciplinary artist working through a Black futurist lens. Phillips is the founder of the Afro-Futurist Affair, founding member of the Metropolarity Queer Speculative Fiction Collective, and co-creator of the art duo Black Quantum Futurism. Phillips's work has been featured in the New York Times, The Wire, New York Magazine, Boston Review, Hyperallergenic, and eFlux. Thanks so much for being here with us, Rasheedah.
Thanks for having me.
Danielle Purifoy is an assistant professor of geography and environment at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she also serves as a faculty project lead for the UNC Environmental Justice Action Research Clinic. Danielle's research intersects geography, law, environmental studies, and Black studies to learn about Black placemaking practices from town formation to ecological stewardship. She's the former race and place editor of the incredible Scalawag, a media organization devoted to Southern storytelling, journalism, and the arts. If you're not already reading Scalawag, you should. You can find her work in Society and Space, Annals of the American Association of Geographers, Inside Higher Ed, Environmental Sociology, Transactions of the Institute of British Geographers, Oxford American, and Southern Cultures, among other publications. Thank you so much for being here, Danielle.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get out of the way and let y'all kick off the conversation. Yep, here we go.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And thanks to Firestorm for hosting us.
Yeah, and thank you, Liberty, for corralling us and getting us started here. Hey, Rasheedah.
Hi, how are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm good. It's a muggy evening in Durham, but it's not as hot as it might be, so I'm thankful for that. Yeah, how are you doing?
Doing all right over here in still sunny-ish California. It's kind of muggy today too. I'm out in Los Angeles, but yeah, it's doing good.
Okay, good. Well, first, I just want to say thank you. I mean, I said it a little bit before we started here, but thank you so much for writing this book. I it yeah, it's really a transformative book, I think, in the sense of the erasure of boundaries around these sort of siloed disciplinary kind of ways of thinking, emerging of the sciences, humanities, social sciences, law. Like it's really what we might call multidisciplinary. And I feel like you might be thinking more kind of like even anti-disciplinary, like let's think about how all of these forms of knowledge collide and intersect and relate to one another. And so that was very clear throughout the book. And I just, yeah, really appreciate it. And I'm really looking forward to giving copies to a bunch of friends and sharing with my students and that kind of thing. Um, so just for the audience, what we're going to do is probably about 35 to 40 minutes of discussion between Rasheedah and I, and then we're going to turn it over to you all for questions. And please put your questions in the chat, and we will get to them. Yeah, we're going to make sure to get to them because I'm sure a lot of you have either read this book or are curious about this book and may have lots of questions for Rasheedah tonight. So I think how I'm going to start here is I'll just say briefly how I met Rasheedah and kind of what may be landing us here today. So back in, was that 2022?
I think it was,
The
yes.
unconference?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I got an invitation from Rasheedah to the Vera List Center at the New School, the New School in New York for the Time Zone Protocols Unconference. Did I get that right? I was remembering the title. And I at the time was like, wait, like, what is this? Like, I was like, I've never heard of this project. I'm like frantically looking up Rasheedah to like kind of learn more about them and Black quantum futurism. And I was like, yeah, you know, someone who studies Black geographies and specifically places that we might call historic Black towns. I thought, yeah, I mean, maybe some time has something to do, certainly, right, with these places. Um, but I'm not sure what. And honestly, on the strength of that curiosity alone and seeing the work that you did, that you had already done with Black Quantum Futurism, I was like, I'm going. I was like, I don't know who I'm gonna know there. Like, I haven't been in New York in years, like, but I'm going. And it was phenomenal. Like, it was one of the best sort of gatherings of scholars and writers and artists that I've ever attended. Um, and one of the tasks of this unconference was coming up with new time zone protocols. Um, and we'll get into kind of the why of that and the sort of history of that in a second here. But I just want to say that it really that event really transformed a lot of my thinking about my own work, about how temporality and questions around what history is and Black futures, in particular Afrofuturism, more specifically, how those things apply to my work on Black geographies in really small, often rural, right, or peri-urban Black spaces. So I just want to thank you for inviting me in, again, for inviting me into that space and to give some folks some context for how we are in conversation tonight. Yeah, I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, or we can start with the questions.
No, I'm just surprised to hear that you hadn't been thinking about like time sort of specifically in your work before then, because the presentation and workshop and engagement that you did at the unconference was just so brilliant and so like well thought, particularly and I mentioned it in the book around like deadlines and like and geography and time, and so just really brilliant work and appreciate that. We've been in conversation ever since to sort of deepen how we're engaging with those things in each of our spaces. So.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it was just such a provocation that I had to think about it more. And I was just like, okay, here's what I got. And yeah, it really, yeah, it was just really an amazing, amazing time, an amazing event. So this book, Dismantling the Masters Clock, um, really is an engagement. I would say a pretty deep dive, right, into quantum physics, right? As deep a dive as I've ever heard someone who is also doing work around like law and right and like history, as I've right like seen done in one book. Um, and I wanted to maybe start with um, maybe a little bit of backstory about your foray into quantum physics, right? Like kind of what led you there and like and why.
Yeah, so I talk about this a little bit in the book. It's it's a very nonlinear path into something like quantum physics, especially as a person who's not like a scientist or a physicist, right? And part of that journey was reading Kindred actually by Octavia Butler. Was like one of my first ways of thinking about it. But actually, even before that, because I didn't read Kindred until late, I came across it when I was in law school, and that was my first time, even though I have always been a big sci-fi fan since I was a kid. That was my first time encountering a Black woman protagonist in a time travel story. So that really prompted a lot of thinking around Afrofuturism in particular, and the very particular ways that time and temporality shows up for Black women, like how we feel time through our body, how we move through time, those sorts of things. But even before that, to be honest, a lot of my thinking around quantum physics probably was influenced by The Matrix, by the film The Matrix. Like I grew up with that film. I was probably maybe 14 when it came out, and it that series of films like really opened my mind up of like what is the Matrix, right? And like how are these things happening? And it actually got me a lot into philosophy, like that series of films, and like just reading about like what's behind it and the sort of Christian paradoxes and morals and parables that are behind underlying the Matrix, and then also like some of the quantum mechanics that are involved in like how Neo moves and how they do all these things. So that was actually really how I first got into quantum physics, probably, but it was much more rigorous and informed as I started like reading other Black science fiction writers, getting back into science fiction myself after law school, and again, just trying to break down the mechanics of time travel for Black people, just being like wholly inspired by Kindred, wholly inspired by the fact that the character was moving through time in a way that I had never seen before. There was no time machine. There was no white man. There was no scientist, white man scientist sort of manipulating the situation. It was like purely through this like sort of DNA cultural sort of notion of this ancestor pulling her back in time. And so I was just deeply fascinated by that. And started to think, writing my own stories again, but also thinking about these mechanics as being very parallel to quantum physics in terms of like that ability to move backwards and forwards in time, that ability for a particle to move backwards and forwards in time, and to say that these things are reality, these things are situated in how other cultures think about time, so that we can bring these sorts of realities into how we think about and actually move through time and reality. It's not just something that's isolated to science fiction or to scientists thinking about time travel, right? It can belong to us. These sort of ways of moving through the world can belong to us as well. So that's kind of where it started, but yeah.
Yeah. No, it's so dope. And just the combination of writing science fiction, speculative fiction of your own. I know you have a book of speculative fiction that you've written before this one. Um, and but then also to really start to do this deep dive into quantum physics, like the science behind it, the mechanics of it. So what I want to do is, this is sort of like selfish on my part to make sure that I really understand. One in your first chapter, you really give us such a like in-depth, I mean, I don't know how in-depth is. I'm not a physicist, right? But like at least are building a foundation for us to understand some basics of quantum physics as a foundation for the arguments that you're making throughout the rest of the book. And yeah, I just thank you for making taking the time to really do that and writing in a way that I felt like I was like, I think I'm understanding this. And I think that this helps me um, yeah, clarify a lot of the arguments that you're making here. So to my understanding, right, at a macroscopic level, right, most of us, right, many of us experience time sort of as unidirectional, right, as going in one direction, we age, things that break don't, reconstitute themselves. There's entropy, right? There's just kind of this seeming forward, never ending forward motion. But at the micro level, right, the level of particles that quantum physicists are looking at, um, what um, what we're seeing is that time operates differently, right? And that these particles exist in relationship to one another, can move in a variety of directions, and also that time is experienced relative to the observer, right? So it's not a kind of static linear thing. And there's like these distinctions between classical physics that you're making and quantum physics, right? I.e., like Einstein's theory of relativity. And sort of what we come away with is that hegemonic time, right? A dominant sense of time is Western centered, and it is focused on this, that is focused more on this sense of time as linear, right? This arrow of time, never ending progress forward, and relative independence between the past, present, and the future. And what I see you arguing here is that like quantum physics and relativity, right, what these folks at the European Organization for Nuclear Research, where you had this fellowship in Switzerland, were working on, has this deep resonance with African, Afro-diasporic, and Black epistemologies and cosmologies, and that make the case for the coexistence of multiple temporalities and sort of what you're calling kind of a temporal justice. Did that seem right?
Yes.
Did I like, okay,
That was a
okay, good.
beautiful, very cohesive summary. Yes.
Okay, awesome. No, I like read it 3 times and I was like, okay, I'm gonna get this because physics was not my strong suit in high school. I left it there.
Me
So
neither.
this is my first time picking it back up. But I think you did a beautiful job explaining. So I'm curious, this really blew my mind. You have several of the scientists, collaborators from CERN in Switzerland who work on the Hadron Collider. Um, you know, talking to you about how they're thinking about time and the level of uncertainty, right? About like defining what time is. And so I'm really curious about maybe if you could say a little bit about the core implications to you about the connections between time from sort of a quantum physics perspective and these Afro-diasporic Black and African temporalities that you're talking about. You talk about social justice, temporal justice, but yeah, just to give you an opportunity to talk about like how you're at the core, kind of how you're thinking of those connections and their implications.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the places it starts is with understanding or grasping or grappling with the ways in which time has been literally and physically and materially weaponized against Black people to understand, right? Like how what are the implications for all of this conversation about time, right? Because it's one thing we can space feels somewhat more tangible, right? When we're talking about space, because it's something that we can see, whether we're talking about the universe and the stars and the things out there, or whether we're relating space to what's around us and what's on the ground and like actual land. Time is a bit harder to do that. And so you have to like make it real, make it physical for how these things are actually being activated. And one of those ways, and what I talk about in the book at length, is how time has been weaponized very physically against Black people, like whether it's a clock that's used to regulate, the time of people who are enslaved and their labor, and physically like actually being punished for not being on time or for working too slowly or whatever it may be, to the sort of very geopolitical politics, social politics, in terms of how time was mediated to actually be able to reach these continents and colonize them, which is part of what I was talking about with the time zone protocols and the prime meridian unconference, is that things like chronometers, these clocks that were put onto ships that actually allowed these people to get to these continents, because before that they weren't able to navigate to find them, because they were crashing and all these other things. So just the very literal ways in which time, and then when we talk about Black people, sort of being seen as uncivilized, seen as outside of time, right? Like in terms of being seen either as ahistorical or as locked into history, right? As people who are uncivilized. And so civilization in Western society is associated with timeliness. Like just quite literally, scholars have talked about this, how these so-called missionaries went out to the continent and were like literally grading people on how on time they were, right? In terms of like the Bushmen being the least civilized because they have no sense of, no perceived sense of time, on up to, sort of this categorization. So just very literal, very tangible ways that time has been used against us. And so when you think about that, like, how is that? How can time in this sort of linear sense be weaponized against people? It has to be something that there's a difference in terms of how those folks may have been experiencing time that is antithetical to this notion of progress, this notion of manifest destiny, and getting out and staking our claim, not just in land, not just in space, but in time as well, right? When we're talking about staking our claim into space, we're also talking about the future. We're also making sure that generations from now, my family continues to own this land, continues to own this space, continues to be, sort of in authority over things. So time is very much involved in that. And so it takes like sort of uncovering that and making it tangible before you can be like, all right, well, what's the implications of not that, the opposite of that. And the other thing to name, in terms of like how these things connect, because I know it can sometimes, even though you explained it so beautifully, it can sometimes be this like leap between like, all right, so what does this mean in terms of how we experience time? And then you're bringing in science, you're bringing in sociology, you're bringing in land and law and all these things. But again, these things are intertwined in ways that have been invisibilized. And so when I talk about like the court systems and people encountering how they encounter time in a court, that it quite literally strips them of their ability to access housing in the future or to have a sense of freedom in the future, right? So these things are just very intertwined. And then the other thing I'll say about that is that, in terms of thermodynamics, and I try to talk about this in the book a little bit in terms of like just the science behind it, and the science of general relativity and the science of like classical physics, the science of the big things, does follow a different set of rules, or we're told that, right? And that different set of rules does not allow us to sort of look back into the past, right? It tells us that things are always on this forward trajectory. And that, even though it's a scientific thing, right, it has implications for real life, as anything does, right? Like just because it's in science doesn't mean it's not touch, even though we can feel like it's disconnected, or like, all right, you have to have a degree to understand how that's actually impacting your everyday life. But I'm telling you, right, like it does, in terms of how we think about the world, how we see the world, how we see what's possible in the world. And so it was really just a revelation to be able to come across, other, once you start to look at it and start to do the research, right, it's not always visible, and it's not always these things that feel, again, can sometimes feel abstract. But just again, looking at the ways that, in Afro-diasporan cultures, how they think about time and how it's intertwined with things like agriculture, right? And markets, right? Like that's a way of counting time when we come together in a market, and we come together, right? Or the certain types of rituals that can only be done at certain times of the year, or even the ways that in which we name our children, all these things that were stripped from us, right? When folks were enslaved and colonized, but things that we retain, in other ways, right? There's this syncretism that happens as well. So that's some of it, right? And just started to uncover what those things meant, and how in Afro-diasporan cultures, and again, this is these are generalizations, right? Because there's thousands of cultures on the African continent that experiences time in different ways, right? But when you start to generalize it and see these features, things like, again, time being intertwined with ecology and economic cycles, or time, these features of time that make sure that we're not locking the past out, we're not locking the future out, but that the past is always on some level here with us, even if it's not on the same physical plane. And we can see that in how we set up altars, the sorts of everyday rituals that we have in the Black community, how those things touch on different notions of time. And yeah, and I just started to see a lot of parallels between that, the idea of Sankofa, right? That you can turn back around. The past is not locked off from you. You can turn back around, bring the past into the present, right? So all these different principles of time, CP time, all of these things, right? That are a part of our Black culture, a part of Afro-diasporan culture, that are different ways of surviving through, being in, thriving in time, that are often locked off from us in the sort of rat race and the time is money equation that we find ourselves in Western society. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful. Yeah, and I feel like there's this piece here in the book where you're talking about the inherent kind of non-linearity, right, of time, in the sense that um the future can influence the past, right? And and the present all at once, right? And that it's all quite relational. And it made me really think about um, memory, actually. I'll get to like saying a little bit more about memory in a later question, but the way that the past is remembered um, is always being reinterpreted, right? And redefined in ways that shift our understandings of what the past was, right? So just this idea that like what happened in the past like is static and was experienced the same by everyone, right? And everyone has the same kind of perspective on it, that it can be kind of locked in. Um, even if you're not getting into any of the kind of science or any of this sort of things, even in our ordinary conversations, we can see how fluid actually, right? Like time is, in terms of all of the ways that we interpret history. As actually, since we both have law backgrounds, I know that you've engaged some with like Derek Bell's work, um, and Derek Bell, who's a prominent scholar in the critical race theory movement, and also a really big fan of science fiction and speculative fiction, and wrote some himself. And yeah, just the idea of time, as this kind of way of so sorry, I'm remembering in I'm forgetting the book. um I'm blanking on it right now, but he writes about, because he's around
Is it Faces at the
Tony
Bottom of the Well?
Faces at the Bottom of the Well, and he's around he and Toni Morrison were contemporaries. And one of the things that he talks about in that book, just in the very opening of that book, was how little he understood or knew about slavery, right? And it wasn't a thing that it was something that he knew happened, but it wasn't a thing that was really profoundly shaping his memory. And it was actually his generation that really started to do that kind of deep dive into understanding, right, histories of slavery, and kind of unearthing these stories, how we get stories like Beloved, right, like and bringing it into a consciousness that really, right, redefines, right, like our memory of the past. Like we don't like, it's very difficult, I think, for us to write the kind of stories, or even someone like Octavia Butler to write the kind of stories, right, that she was writing, without that kind of move, right, um, to actually unearthing more of those kinds of histories. So it's just like a really important, yeah, something that I was really reflecting on as I was reading this book, was like, wow, yeah, like we, generations past who were closer to slavery but who did not live through it might have actually known less, right, about the nature of it than us living today, right? Or the depth of it, or understand it in a very different kind of way. So yeah, ways that like the future is really like quite literally shaping our memory and understanding of the past as well. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And I think yeah, and yes, all yes to all of what you said. And um just that idea of memory as something that has been stripped from us in these certain ways, but that is still very much embedded in our landscapes, right? Like when it comes to and I think we'll probably talk about this a little bit later because I talk about this in a Project Time Capsule chapter, but like even the sort of monuments, street names, like I was able to go to Tulsa a few months ago, and just hearing about like some of the street names that they tried that had to wait decades to change. Some of the street names that were named after the people who were involved in dropping the bomb on Greenwood, right? So just how baked in it is to our surroundings, to our landscapes. And I know for you, like this is a question that you think about a lot. But it's hard to articulate it in this way to be like, okay, here, this thing happened here, but we feel it, right? Like even just like walking through Tulsa, the street that I was on, like I could feel it. If I'm in St. Louis, I can feel it. I can hear the stories, right? Like, even if I can't like articulate it or understand what I'm looking at visibly, if that makes sense.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the kind of yeah, like the space-time matters, right, that you kind of articulate in the book, that sort of overlapping um sense, right? That you can be in a space and kind of be in a space and feel like, at this sort of day-to-day human level that you're like in the space of the present, and you can also feel, right, those like those histories, like right, folding in and understand kind of what happened here, right, and also what might happen here, right, in the future as well. So I wanted to kind of pivot a little bit to another chapter. Um, and this is the chapter, The Race Against Space-Time. And I was thinking of this chapter in particular because I know that, some of the core of your work has been community lawyering around housing in particular. And I, have been following the news around the fascist takeover of DC, right? And the directive to all unhoused people to vacate the city, right? And reading this book alongside, right, this like these executive orders and these kind of this media coverage, yeah, just really got me thinking in particular about this chapter. And in this chapter, The Race Against Space-Time, you're articulating like various ways that the law and lawyering, right, are fundamentally shaped and restricted by rigid Western temporalities. You've already kind of covered that a little bit, but we see them played out, right, repeatedly in your work in legal aid, trying to do things like maintaining people's housing security. And I'd really love if you, yeah, just kind of at this level as a practicing attorney, and I know now, right, working with Policy Link, yeah, thinking about how this works, right, and how what you call these CPT symmetries from both quantum physics and Black epistemologies might shift something about these cycles of displacement that you have been fighting for years at this point, right? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, it's definitely a core way of how I think about my work and approach my work. I'm not a practicing attorney at the moment, but definitely it has guided my work when I was practicing. Especially to understand that it at some point it dawned on me, as it has on others, that so much of the legal system is about time. Like it is very literally about time. We can talk about deadlines, hearing dates, statutes of limitations, all of those things, right? Those things are very much operational in terms of linear standardized timeframes. And then those structures presume, right, as you noted, that everyone is moving through time the same, that the clock on the wall is objective, and that we all have equal access to resources to be able to meet those timelines, right? And this is like something that folks say in passing, which I'm always like, this is not true, actually, which is that everybody has the same 24 hours a day, right? Like we do not all have the same 24 hours a day. If you are a person who is low income, who needs to commute to get to work, right? Like your timeline and how much time you spend getting there, right, takes away from your day. Your ability to, for a person who is low income and has to afford an apartment, often has to work 2.5 jobs, depending on where you are, in order to be able to make their rent, and have a home for their family. So we do not all have the same 24 hours. We do not all move through time the same way. And just as time in our society equals money, right? There is a sense of time poverty that many people who are experiencing other types of poverty encounter. And so this was very true, definitely for housing cases. I did both eviction defense work to keep tenants from being evicted, as well as mortgage foreclosure defense work to keep homeowners from being foreclosed upon, and then did a lot of housing preservation work for affordable housing that would be lost in time to the powers that be, and to neglect and enfranchisement of particular communities. And so for all of these things, time is super present when we're talking about how long, before a tenant has to respond to a complaint, how long they have in order to vacate a unit. How, if they are 5 minutes late to court and they don't hear their name on time, even though they may have had to take 2 buses to get down to the courtroom, right, they are evicted, could be evicted 21 days later. And that eviction, that one-time situation that may have happened, right, and the next day, maybe they got a new job, they got, maybe there was a funeral, whatever the case may have been, that eviction record stays with them for the rest of their lives, right? Unless you're in a place where it can be sealed, or something else can happen. So just the way time is situated there. But when you are, and not that this is much better for Black and Brown people, but when you're a property owner, right? Because property ownership is the American dream, and because we value property owners in this country more than we do renters. We see renters as transient people who are, should be eventual homeowners, should have what we call housing tenure, right? Me as an attorney, because we value property ownership more, I can make a mortgage foreclosure play out over 10 years, right? I can file a bankruptcy. I can do all these different things to extend that timeline. And that's part of my job as an attorney, to extend that timeline for people. But just the parallel for, if you're a renter, how it can happen over a matter of days versus a homeowner, how it can happen over a matter of months to years, right? So just these are all features of our legal system, of the things that govern us in society as humans, regardless of where we sit in terms of income. So all of these things have these sort of time elements to them. And that, when it comes to some of the bigger things that really impacts the ways that Black communities experience time in relation to things like historical displacement, intergenerational trauma, ongoing systemic delay, ongoing systemic denial, whether it's you're on a housing list where you have to wait 10 years in Philadelphia, right, to get a vouchers to be able to afford your housing. And then what happens to people who get pushed out of their communities due to gentrification, or due to the city having a plan for that community that, extends out 20 years from now so that they can reap the benefits, but that community gets scattered to the four winds. So these are all of the things that, in terms of, and you can do this kind of analysis for any piece of, anything really. But for the housing work, this is how this shows up. And it is absolutely connected to these historical features of oppression. So when we talk about things like redlining, when we talk about things like Jim Crow, when we talk about sundown towns, right? Like, isn't what Trump's doing like a version of a sundown town in DC, right? And how these things quite literally impact Black people and brown people in particular. And so I fear, it's as with everything happening, it's very scary. to see, that they're blatantly trying to put unhoused people into concentration camps, because that's what's happening, and that most of those people are going to be Black and brown folks. In terms of thinking about CPT and how these things offer, alternatives or other ways of thinking about time, even within our systems. So just to quickly share what CPT is. So CPT, of course, so for those of you who know, right, CPT signals color people's time, right? Like that's the sort of colloquial term that is used to sort of, and it's has been mostly throughout history used derogatorily, but I think there's been a reclamation of that term in a lot of ways. But CPT meaning that Black people, generally or stereotypically show up late to things. And then there is CPT symmetry. So in quantum physics, basically CPT stands for three things: parity, charge, parity, and time. And it's sort of a way, it's this invariance of universal laws that say that these things are symmetrical. I'm not going to get too much into it. I talk about it more in the book. But essentially, what I'm offering in terms of, it's a metaphor, but it's not a metaphor. Like the language sometimes escapes, but it's like really, we see it as a metaphor, but for me, it is actually a one for one. Like it actually, there is something going on there that goes beyond metaphor. And so for a Black temporal epistemology, this idea that time can be symmetrical, that time is not just, again, on a quantum physics level, it's not just something that's running forward in terms of progress or in terms of we're always running into the past, but that there is a way to open up the past, to reverse time, if you will, to reclaim past futures, to add information into the past, to connect the past into the future, to connect it to the present. And so how this shows up very specifically in policy work, because right, again, it's like, what's that leap? How are you actually connecting this into real life? So what I just talked about in terms of someone who has an eviction record, that eviction record follows them throughout time and is used to, make decisions in the future about something that's happened in the past. And rarely do you get any kind of opportunity to say, hey, that eviction record actually is wrong, or that eviction record actually, there's more information that can be added into that past event, because in linear time, right, we can't open up the past, right? Like it is what it is, it's static. And so we were able to basically craft a policy in Philadelphia called the Renters Access Act that gives the opportunity for someone with an eviction record to open up that past, add information in, correct their record, bring a new record in, right? And then essentially shift the dynamics of the relationship to the future. So now that eviction record is either sealed or can't be a valid basis for determining whether or not somebody's going to be a good tenant, right? That automatically changes that relationship that person has with their ability to access housing in the future, which wasn't before possible with this scheme where time was linear and this eviction record was linear. So that's just one example, but I give a lot of other examples in the book as well.
Yeah, that's so helpful. Thank you for kind of laying out CPT symmetry, connections to color people time, and then also on this very kind of practical day-to-day level, like, this idea of treating time as relational, right? That, as nonlinear. And, it's really interesting this, as you're talking, I was thinking about how even though, right, this, kind of Western hegemonic concept of like a unidirectional time is certainly at play in law and in these cases that you're talking about, there's also an inconsistency, right, in the sense of um, how time works. And I'll speak for just the United States context, that the past, present, and future in this country are also treated as independent, right? So that the past is not supposed to influence the future in a variety of ways, right? We are not supposed to think that the fact that we went through hundreds of years of colonialism and slavery has anything to do with um, with modern life, right? there's meant to be a kind of like lopping off, right, of past and history, except for in these particular cases where it's like, oh, this could have something to do with and disrupting, right, the engines of capitalism and property ownership and that kind of in these systems, and that's when the past matters, right? So the levels of, you know, varying kinds of inconsistencies of when history matters and when it doesn't, right? And like how we treat temporalities, I think is really evident too, and sort of came to mind as I was reading. I was just like, yeah, this country hates history, right? Like we're like literally seeing the evisceration, right, of the past right now. Like they're like scrubbing it. They're like modifying every like kind of idea about the about the past, or either trying to scrub it clean, right, or erase it from memory altogether. But certainly, right, when we, you know, in these very specific kinds of contexts, right, we're meant to, you know, hold on to the past forever, right, as with a kind of eviction record. Um, so I want to maybe this is like the last kind of formal question I'll ask you, and then we can talk a bit, see what folks have to say in Q&A. I wanted to link two chapters of your book. The chapter called Time Zone Protocols and Time Zone Protocols and Project Time Capsule. Because I thought, this is circling back to memory, thought a lot in those chapters about how both have something to do or connect to our sense of memory. And just to say, right, these time zone protocols, which, you know, you articulate the current ones that are in existence, right, which is why you're at roughly what, like 5:48 where you are, I'm at 8:48 where I am right now. You know, were created in 1884, actually relatively new, right, in the sort of broader scheme of things, you know, really overrode, right, like several different time meridians, right, and time horizons, and also senses of temporality across the world. And so just even imagining a world pre-1884, which it doesn't feel like that hard to imagine, but like if it's a world without these time zones, it's like actually hard for me to like sense like what those temporalities were, and how like that kind of shift would radically alter, right, like people's senses of temporality, and also their kind of memory and understanding of themselves in time and place. Yeah, so that's kind of one thing that I've been thinking about. But then this Project Time Capsule, which is literally, I mean, in our society, all about memory, right? Like all about like trying to unearth a sense of what was happening in this place at a particular time, ostensibly in order to show how much progress we've made, right? Yeah, you really do a great job at thinking about the different kinds of time capsules that can exist for very different purposes, and under different epistemic traditions around temporality. So yeah, I was wanting to kind of, you know, you don't have to link these two if you want. There's things that felt linked in my head about like, you know, if we're opening ourselves back up to this idea of multiple overlapping relational temporalities, what might those things do to memory, right? And I'm just thinking of those two chapters in relation to it because yeah, they really connected well for me.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for sharing that connection that you made. I think that's absolutely true. And I think yeah, part of what I was getting at in the book with like this cosmogram of like the book is meant to be read non-linearly, in terms of like making connections between different things. So I think that's absolutely spot on, and really appreciate that you yeah, that you're tying those two things together. And I think they do time together. I think you know, both chapters are thinking about not just these sort of geographic divisions, but the social political protocols that assign whose time is legible and whose time is rendered as like marginal, right? Or whose time is not important enough to blip on our collective timeline. And I think, of course, that's mirrored, that tends to be mirrored in memory and how we think about history and our historical landscape in this country. So it becomes about, you know, exactly what you said, like whose memories are getting archived, whose memories can get erased, can be pulled out of the archive, right? Whose memories and times are out of sync with those dominant timelines of history, right? And so for Project Time Capsule is thinking about how that erasure, you know, I always hate to put too much on like resistance, because I don't think like all of our things are about resistance, right? Some of it is just natural, this is how we live, right? And it happens to resist the dominant thing. But it's, you know, it was not done in the name of resistance. And so thinking about, for example, the ways in which what I talk about in Project Time Capsule, these sub pit floors that enslaved people had, where they kept their gems and their ritual objects and all these things. And like, sure, yes, at some level it's an act of resistance against Christianity and enslaved people like stripping you, but at the same time it's just like this is our way of engaging in the world, this is our way of being in the world, this is how we relate to the world in these things. And so it's yeah, Project Time Capsule is really thinking about those sorts of things, how we embed memory just by being, just and the pockets of memory that we build into our built environment that again are illegible. And in some ways, right, like I think about like we want them to be illegible, like, and I think about what is the work that I'm doing what's my responsibility in either making them more legible, because some things, right, like we need to gatekeep our languages and our ways of storing memory and archiving because it can get so easily ripped from us, but then also that it is part of our work, I think, to bring forth these other possibilities and these other ways of relating to time and memory, so that yeah, we can do the work of resisting erasure. So yeah, part of it is like that memory is not just retrieving the past, right? But it's active co-creation of present and future. And I think some of that was the work that we were doing at the Prime Meridian Unconference, right? Is like, let's create these protocols of time together. Like there were ones that were set for us, you know, over 100 years ago, in this very colonial context that continues to activate in that way, continues to proliferate in that way, in terms of erasing local times, local ecologies, right? Because these things also connect to our environment, our natural environment, as well as our built environment. When you have in the United States different time zones that regulate what resources people might get in one time zone versus another, or you know, you might have two places that are geographically and ecologically connected that have different time zones, and people have to tend to those things differently when there might be connections that are above and beyond the sort of mechanical ways in which we're imposing time on these different places. So yeah, and yeah, it's all about all of that stuff. So there's definitely connections between those things. I'm not sure if I answered your question specifically, but
No, you did. Thank you. Yeah. So, I think we're getting close to like the close of this portion and maybe opening up to Q&A. I was just curious if there was anything else that you wanted to make clear to folks about the book, or anything that you're kind of percolating on now that you wanted to share before we kind of open it up.
no, I don't think so. I think
Okay.
one, I'm just super excited that people are engaging with it and reading it. I know it's very long, and yeah, it's, you know, I the book is constructed to take on the form in which the work is unfolding, and so I want folks to like engage with it to the extent that it feels good for them non-linearly, and like to take their time with it, right? Like because there's a lot of as you said, it's anti-disciplinary, it's interdisciplinary, and it's also yeah, it's trying to also invoke the ways in which these things can be actualized. You know, sometimes it's through art, sometimes it's through policy, but just hoping to give folks different ways of thinking about how these things can be made tangible in a real world.
Cool. Well, thank you, Rasheedah. I guess we'll turn it over to Liberty. Are you gonna do the Q&A portion?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump
Okay.
in.
All
Yeah,
right.
thanks y'all so much for this great conversation. And for preparing excellent questions, Danielle. We do have a few coming in the Q&A. Uh, Maybe I'll just start pulling a few from there. Laura is asking about spiritual practices or rituals involving time that you think we should be engaging in now, and says individually and collectively, locally or nationally, speaking about the current US context, but of course, that's not at all, not at all separate from global dynamics. She had any thoughts on rituals and spiritual practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, and a lot of our work, so I'm here as Rasheedah, but I'm part of a collective or duo called Black Quantum Futurism that I share with my partner Kamei. And part of our work is around building out some of these tools. And so if you go on the time zone protocols website that I think Liberty popped into the chat, there are some practices there. Some of them, I don't really call them spiritual because I don't want to dictate for others like what spirit it's spiritual for me certainly, but I don't want to dictate for others what hits the spirit versus what's like more practical, what's not practical. Um, but yeah, that website, I have a website called Black Woman Temporal that has also some additional rituals, time travel experiments, just different ways of like playing with and thinking about time. And I definitely think the time zone protocols is that project is one that is meant to be more for community, right? More for and there's different like ways of setting up workshops, setting up discussions, and I give some tips. I have a little zine that talks about different ways. And the time zone protocol website has all of this stuff too. So yeah, I think there's different things there. Some of the protocols that some of the folks who came and spoke at the unconference came up with are just these kinds of rituals, these kinds of practices. Because if we're looking to shift or create new timelines, we definitely can't do that as individuals, or at least from my standpoint, it has to be done in community. I think of time as something that is created within and with community. And so, yeah, these practices are meant to help facilitate thinking about that, whether it's in your own community, whether you're having global conversations, conversations with other people in other states, whatever that may be, being able to come up with some ways of connecting in time together and relationally that is not bound to the clock, not bound to the calendar, the linear year. And folks have come up with a lot of different things. So again, if you go to that time zone protocols website, folks have submitted their own rituals and things as well. um yeah, yeah, so yes, plenty of stuff out there. Happy if folks want to reach out, but look on our websites, and a bunch of those tools and things are there.
Awesome. There's another question in the chat that maybe is a little bit related, but takes a sort of different angle. This participant is asking about a personal behavior that may have changed as a result of beginning this inquiry into the nature of time. I feel like that could be a question for both of you, if you have thoughts about ways in which this work has changed your life.
Yeah, for me, lots of different ways. I think some of those ways I talked about a little bit earlier in terms of my practice as an attorney and how I approach that work. I talk about this a lot in the book, but just some of the principles that I use in my work, in my policy work, in my work as an advocate is around thinking about time as abundant versus like thinking about time as scarce. And that's been extremely like just that principle has been extremely useful for me in very practical ways in terms of like um when I work with organizers and when I think about what's possible in the world, right? Like it pushes me when I think about time as abundance to go beyond sort of the narrow constrictions of like what the law says is possible or what this thing says is possible, but to really be in relationship with the people, right, who are having a vision for the future and how we get to that vision. And so it has definitely changed the way that I work with communities, work in community, work with folks, and what I think is possible for the world. Like it really has shifted, not just this work, but like Afrofuturism in general has shifted my mindset from one where the world is deterministic and we're running on some timeline that is already set, and I have no influence over that, to a situation where I do believe with community that I have influence over the timeline, over the future, and that we can co-create it. So it like has quite literally shifted that for me. And the other thing I forgot to mention for the last question is that we're going to be doing a version of the Prime Meridian Conference and Time Zone Protocols in Seoul, South Korea this month, later this month. And so that's, again, just like we're trying to spread and set up in different places these different protocols of time for different communities. So so yeah, it's definitely sort of a global conversation happening with some of this work as well. But Danielle, would love to hear from you if you have any.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll speak. I mean, I feel like there's more for me to dig into since reading this book, but I've had since 2022, but since the unconference kind of be to be thinking more expansively around time. And I think, one of the things that I come back to or have tried to like start allowing myself to do is to yes, like start to think about time differently, right? And about my time, my relationship to time differently. Um, Understanding about like, um, what everything from like how much time am I giving myself, right, to do a thing, right? I use the example in the unconference of the deadline because it's something that as an academic, I feel like I'm always up against some kind of deadline. And I feel like a lot of us can relate to that sort of thing. Um, and they've had a lot of shame about like missing deadlines and like that kind of thing, and really understanding it's like, oh, right, to your point earlier, Rasheedah, right, like none of us has the same 24 hours in the day, right? It really depends on how much you're taking on, how much is being demanded out of you, right? And the various kinds of resources that you have access to get through what you need to get through. So it's shifted my relationship to work for certain, right? To kind of actually think about like what, if we're going with this sort of artificial temporal thing that we're calling a deadline, right? What is required for me to have the spaciousness in order for that to happen, or maybe if it's just not going to happen, right? Like, like people invent deadlines, and like what I find is that time is typically a lot more abundant, right, than people say that it is, right? So that's one thing that I thought a lot about. It may feel like controversial, right, like in a kind of way, but just realistically, right? The level of things that we're holding and the kind of resources that we have to get a thing done are quite different. So that's a real major way that I think I've started to think about temporality differently. And I guess the other thing I'll say is seasonality. I really have started paying closer attention to seasons beyond kind of consumer framings, right? Like capitalist framings of seasons, right? Around holidays and like all of that kind of thing. Really starting to pay close attention to the light, right? It is starting to get darker now because we're past the summer solstice, right? Things are progressively getting darker, and that has something to do with my energy, right? It has something to do with the amount of capacity that I have. I can see what is shifting in the ecosystem around me beyond just thinking about the fall as this kind of time that, oh, now it's back to school and it's all that kind of thing, but like quite literally thinking about what is happening ecologically. And that's actually been really, I don't know, like grounding for me, right? To be like, okay, here's where we are, right? Here's where we are in the cycle, And so that's one thing. And then also, I haven't really gotten as much into this, but actually thinking about moon cycles as well, right? Like we're always in so many different cycles. And those things have meaning. But in this society, right, it feels so obscured, right, that you need to like make a conscientious effort, right, to pay attention to what those things are and to read up about what those things have meant. So yeah, I mean, Rasheedah's work and being invited into the unconference in this book have just really started to transform like that kind of thinking um, and also practice.
Awesome. Thanks for those great answers. I was also thinking about, Rasheedah, the first time I emailed you, I got an autoresponder from you, sort of setting expectations and sort of explaining your approach to email, which is great because I know that I spend a lot of time being stressed out about the emails that I haven't written. So just even receiving your like auto reply was like a little bit of an invitation for me to like rethink my relationship to like the idea of, that I was supposed to be responding within some certain amount of time, regardless of what else was going on in the world or my life. So I see the practice. Uh, Another question here. Antonia's asking about creative expression shaping your thinking, and says, novels and movies brought you into thinking about quantum physics initially. Are there other creative works that shaped your thinking for this book?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I honestly, so the book was written over, it came out, of course, this year, but it was written over many years. And a lot of the essays were written at different times. So yeah, different things have influenced me. I am a big sci-fi nerd, as I already talked about, and so still watch a lot of time travel stuff, even things that I find really challenging to me. They still are inspirational to me. So I would say that, and some of the things that I name in the book, for example, I don't know if folks got a chance to watch Lovecraft Country, that came out a couple years ago, I think in 2020 or around that time. And the very first episode of that show shows like just quite literally a sundown town, right? And like people moving through a sundown town and having to leave the town literally at the point that the sun goes down. So that influenced a lot of my thinking around like writing that chapter, thinking about how time shows up in these kinds of things, and like really having to like the visualization of it was so stark and like effective for me to like, because with these things, sundown towns definitely still exist, right? But they can feel abstract, especially for somebody like me coming from Philly, which is like a black town, pretty much black city, very black city. So that kind of thing like influenced me. Lovecraft Country, quite a few episodes in there, even though it jumped the shark at some point and got weird. And then other yeah, I didn't read a lot of fiction while writing this. Unfortunately, I haven't. I've been able to get back into fiction after writing this. But I'm a person who reads a lot of science articles, and so like those kinds of things influence me as well. Like I get prompts on my phone every day about something related to physics, and so reading through those things, being able to like bring in some sort of the contemporary sort of ways in which physics continues to astound us and like prove everything wrong that we think we know about the world. Just tried to keep it as fresh as possible in terms of bringing that in. So not sure if that answers the question, but yeah, that's some of the, at some point when you're writing a book, like you have to like put aside all of the influences because the book will be forever long, and it was already too long. And I actually had to cut out a chapter that was about time travel specifically that I'm hoping to like put somewhere else soon. So yeah, a lot of the like creative influences are in that chapter as well. But then also throughout the book, for those who haven't read it yet, I'm relating a lot of these things to like art projects that I've done through Black Quantum Futurism. So for example, we have this grandmother clock that we feature in different exhibitions that is taking on these features of Afro-diasporic sort of quantum time and Black temporalities. So.
Okay, we definitely want that chapter now.
Tell AK
Um,
Press.
yeah, maybe a pamphlet. They publish nice pamphlets. Okay, another question here, and this is cool. We've got someone who starts right off saying, "Hi from Tokyo." It's already Thursday here. and thank you for this wonderful event. When you wrote Dismantling the Master's Clock, did you see it mainly as a way to look at history and society through quantum physics, or also as something that could cross into areas like literature, art, film, music? I think you've already touched on that a little bit. For example, rethinking the sunken place in Jordan Peele's work, or the time and history focused art of Arthur Jaffa or Theaster Gates to reinterpret history and connect it to the present.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think in the last question, I answered that a little bit around like how we use art in our work, and I think my partner is a musician. Her artist name is More Mother, and she really takes music. So like part of our practice is also performance. And so again, we try to actualize these different ways of thinking about time through different mediums, whether it's actual art, installation art, through objects, right? Like creating objects that can mimic or take on these features of nonlinear time. We have this series of clocks that are that we call bio clocks that where one of them is activated by sound. The hands of the clock are activated by sound. One goes backwards the closer you get to it, and the further you get from it, it goes further forward. So yeah, different ways of actualizing this through art, through different objects, through music. My partner really takes seriously the fact that music is time travel. And I talk about sound a lot in the book in terms of like entanglement of notes and all these different things, and how in Black Afro diasporic cultures, sound is activated in ways that are physical, right? And like to use to communicate things like the talking drum, these sorts of things. So yeah, so art, different ways of like understanding this work is very present throughout the book, because I know that there's different ways that people have to enter into this work in order to sort of understand what it means to them, how it applies to them. And just as, sort of multifaceted as I am as a person or as anybody is, right? Like trying to activate those different ways that we can figure out how time shows up for us and how it can be sort of manipulated or bent or shaped to feel like something that allows us to thrive and be creative and not just be bound to a clock or bound to a work clock or other things that really kill our spirit in some ways. So
All right, well, we've got one last question here. This participant is saying, I remember reading Physics of Blackness by Michelle Wright. She spoke about the middle passage, epistemology, and the meaning of blackness over time. And so this participant is asking your thoughts about her work. I know that you do cite Michelle in your book. And maybe more broadly, if there are other thinkers and writers whose work you might direct people towards who are looking for more of this type of inquiry.
yeah, absolutely. So, yes, Michelle M. Wright is referenced in the book, and particularly talking about this notion of progress, and what she says is like, it's impossible for Black people to be able to catch up on this line of progress, given that we're this point that we're starting at, right? And so she's actually fundamentally making a different argument than I am. Her argument is really that it's impossible for any form of temporality to be racially ascribed to Black people, and that Black people, in this sense, right, like to avoid this sort of essentialism of Blackness, right? Black people, by virtue of being Black, experience things in a different way, right? That is essentially her argument in that book. And so fundamentally, we're making different arguments, right? Because I'm not saying what she's saying. But at the same time, right, like it connects in that I am not essentializing Blackness either, right? What I'm talking about in terms of this temporality is one that is born of culture, born of community, that's born of being in relation to each other. And that time is being created in these circumstances and not necessarily something that is biological, right? Because fundamentally saying that, right, is making the same sort of argument that like Thomas Jefferson made about Black people and the essentialization of Black people's nature. And I talk about that a little bit in the book because I want to be absolutely clear that that is not what I'm doing or the argument that I'm making. But essentially, we are making two different arguments. But despite that, she still blurbed the book, which was really, really lovely of her, even though she was like, hey, we're not necessarily saying the same thing, but after I explained to her how her work has inspired my work and thinking, even though we do have different arguments, she did blurb the book. So yes, I am very familiar with her work and have been in conversation with her over the years. And it looks like a couple other questions came in, Liberty. I don't know if
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, we've got Amanda who says, I'm a psychology major attempting to explain how time and space geography are important to our understanding of Black subjectivity and ultimately Black psychological liberation. I'm curious if you have thoughts about the importance of oppressed people in understanding and dismantling the master's clock and space. I think that's sort of your whole book, but maybe any particular thoughts on this this angle of psychology?
Yeah, that's definitely the book. And Danielle, I'd love if you have any thoughts about this, especially because space and geography are named. Please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, oh, well, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a great question and something that is some parts of that are core to my work in thinking about Black geographies in particular. Just um, as a kind of way in here. So the Black geographies that that are the subject of my work are historic Black towns, and I place the historic marker on them because people may not understand these geographies today as Black towns, even though they have these particular historical existences, right? And a lot of them still exist today, but some of them uh, are no longer considered Black towns. And one of the things that has come up for me as, I mean, even before I engaged with Rasheedah's work, was the ways that these Black places were always defined as being out of time. They were almost always defined as dying, right? If you read about them, I had at one point, I still do actually, had a Google alert on like just very specifically like keywords like historic Black towns. And almost inevitably, right, in every single like article, there's something about them being dead or dying or in decline or divestment, like something that takes them out of time and considers them as spaces that don't have anything to teach us, essentially, right? And within this culture, right, any kind of entity that is dead or dying has no resonance for us in the present, right? They are past, and there's something independent, you know, that they kind of pass away, and there's no vision of them in the future. So I think that, you know, this has a lot of implications for Black folks as they, you know, Black folks are constantly in a state of trying to reproduce some version of the Black town, right? We saw this really prominently in 2020 during the George Floyd uprisings, right? That there were several kind of Black town projects that emerged. And for me, like one of the ways that I see these places is as actual, like not even archives, you know, in a way, like really living examples of how places survive despite, right, and sort of within the kind of hegemonic temporalities and violences, right, of white supremacists or white supremacy and white supremacist time. And so my work is really trying to think about how we look to Black geographies. And I think also, right, in the kind of temporalities and epistemic traditions around time to help us understand the kind of spaces that are possible, right? If we can move beyond, right, the master's clock, right? I think Black towns really actually represent that. And it's actually part of why they're defined as dead or dying spaces, right? So that's some of the work is kind of like really looking to places that don't in this culture represent anything having to do with progress, to understand like what it would what a world would look like outside of this particular time space right framework that we're all kind of caught in, this sort of master's clock framework that extended way right past the time of colonialism and slavery, and of course those things are ongoing, right, but into you know, our contemporary, right, like day-to-day lives. I hope that's helpful, but like I think that psychologically, historically, right, there's an importance to really looking at those kinds of places, to kind of help us understand how we can create different kinds of space times, I guess, or spatial futures as well.
I know, Rasheedah, you've shared a number of things in the chat. Is there anything that you want to add in vocally or?
Yeah, just uplifting. Danielle and I had a chance to work together recently. So at my organization Policy Link, we have a initiative called Spatial Futures Initiative that's around reparative spatial justice and thinking about strategies for repair and spatial justice. And so that includes things like land rematriation, community land trust, those sorts of things that allow Black and Indigenous and Brown folks to reclaim land, be in right relationship with land, and preserve their communities and the land that they sit on, and into the far future for future generations. And so we did one that was specifically looking at Black towns and settlements, and very much inspired by like Danielle's work and Andrea Roberts and other scholars who do this work very deeply. And so we created a publication to just really look at some strategies that these communities are using to preserve their communities. And Danielle wrote this really brilliant, beautiful forward for it. So I just popped that in the chat, as well as the Spatial Futures website if folks are curious about learning more. And there's a database on there that shows where these reparative spatial justice initiatives are happening. So whether it's Illinois, where they have one of the country's first housing reparations program in Evanston, to California, where there's community land trusts that are being set up by Indigenous folks and communities, where they're able to get thousands of acres of land rematriated, and can steward the land both for environmental purposes as well as living on the land. So just lots of really beautiful, amazing things happening. Communities able to get reparations for historical harms, even though, you know, at the federal level, we're seeing a lot of challenges, and obviously everything is really shitty, but just know that like at the state and local level, like things are happening. Folks are able to advance a lot of these things. And so there's a lot of hope, a lot of things that we can hold on to. And that gives us examples of how we can survive into the next world to come that we will co-create, right? Because these communities have been able to do that despite the worst conditions possible, right? Like some of them are still going. And so they have a lot to teach us, as Danielle talked about.
Awesome. And I think that's
more
actually,
questions. Sorry.
oh, I was gonna go for it.
Oh yeah, so there looks like there was one more question about how Afrofuturism changed your approach or daily habits regarding your physical body. Good question. Still a work in progress for me to sort of translate it in ways, but I think some of the subtle ways, of course, a lot of like Nat Ministry and Trissa Hersey's work has been instrumental in thinking about this as well. But for me, it's been these things. It's something that Danielle named earlier, which is that I've just given myself permission to think about myself as a working being, right? And put some limits around that. I think for all or most of my life, I've had my working life, I've had very unhealthy relationship with work, a lot of guilt attached to working and not working, and when I'm not working feeling guilty, particularly because of where I come from, my background, and even the kind of folks that I was working with, of being like, all right, I can't take a break because this person's gonna lose their home, or if I stop to do anything, right, and like not understanding that those kinds of things were leading to burnout, leading to my inability to actually do the work at times, leading to a lot of different things. And so just that recognition, right, of being prompted to reassess and re-envision to the extent possible my relationship to work. It's a very slow process, right? It's still ongoing thing in terms of that, but I think I have a much healthier relationship, and I do things like take naps now. Like I've never taken naps, or like I used to sneak them, but now I'm like, fuck it, I'm taking a nap. I'm gonna rest. I'm tired. I can't go on anymore. Like this is not healthy. So taking naps has been one way in which like I've put into practice these things that I tell everybody else to do in terms of thinking about time, right? Like to actually slow down and apply it to myself and think about my relationships to labor and to how I spend my time has been a big thing. Danielle, I don't know if you want to add anything more for yourself or.
Yeah, I mean, just along those lines, like sleep. Yeah, like I'm still like it's so hard for me. Like I was just like, oh, I'm just not that kind of person that needs like 8 hours of sleep. I'm just like, mm. And we can talk about, different people's like sleep habits and that kind of thing, but sleep deprivation has been just like a basic norm for me, right? And it wasn't until I kind of like you know, I don't know, um experienced burnout, right? In a similar way, like that I started to pay attention to like sleep is not like this optional thing. Like it's not optional. And like learning to take it more seriously. And I'm still like it's still hard for me to be like, oh, bedtime, like what? Like so yeah, like and putting boundaries around myself, right? About like, no, like it's time to go to bed, right? Like and one thing that I will say is that actually being in relationship with animals or non-human people has really helped a lot. Because if you've ever had a dog or a cat or any kind of non-human like being in your home, they really do have sleep times, right? Like they don't play around with that. Like they sleep like all day. They like their default sometimes is just sleep. And I don't have anyone in my house like that right now, but yeah, it's taught me actually a lot about the importance of sleep, and they will, that's one thing, like a plug for having a another like a non-human companion is like for real, like they will let you know when it is time to go to sleep. So yeah, that kind of relationality, like, in human world, they're kind of like, we live in your world, but we are not of it. And we need you to go to bed. And I appreciate that. So yeah, I'm trying to learn.
Yes, thank you for bringing in the non-human animals. So I think maybe to take us out, if y'all were willing to share ways that people can keep up with your work or any projects that are upcoming for you. I know folks will be excited to, if they haven't read the book, pick it up, and if they have, then find out what's coming next.
Yeah, so I think I talked about, so I'm doing a performance in New York. So if you're in New York, me and my partner will be there this weekend doing summer stage. And then, as I said, we're bringing time zone protocols to South Korea. And then otherwise, yeah, I'll probably do a few more events this year, but I'm trying to chill for the rest of the year. I have a lot going on. So not much more coming, but I am writing another book. So I have started writing another book. So we'll see if anyone will take it. But that will be next on the horizon in the next couple of years too. So,
No teaser yet about what that book might be?
time.
Okay. Danielle, anything that you'd like to share?
Um, I'm actually in a kind of like, what I say, like chrysalis stage right now. I mean, I'm working on a few things, um, including the like Black Ecology's Field School, which we just had in Durham, and one of our participants, Asia Dorsey, was a facilitator for. It was amazing, and that's a kind of ongoing thing that I'll be working on. But right now, yeah, I'm like on leave from my university. I'm like trying to write. I'm trying to develop a different relationship, just continue to develop a different relationship to work, and rest and stuff, and to like for the first time, like I feel like write from a place of like abundance, um and like spaciousness rather than like to a deadline, like, or like, oh, if you don't get this done by this time, you won't have it in for tenure, all of this kind of stuff. So that's kind of where I am. So, I dropped my IG. I have to revamp my website. Yeah, I took it down because it was hosted by an Israeli company. There's a whole lot going on, right? You gotta like lots of revamping and restructuring, right? That I think is for real necessary. But yeah, you can find me on IG. And yeah, just stay tuned.
Awesome. Well, it's been a huge pleasure, y'all. Thank you to everybody who came, asked great questions. I know we'll all be looking forward to another chance to continue this, but I think it's time to sign off.
Thank you so much. This was an amazing conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you,
Take
First, and
care.
thank you, Liberty. Thanks,
Have a
Rasheedah.
good night. Yes,
You too.
great to meet
Good
y'all.
night, everyone.